I'm Denis Goldberg,
And your date of birth?
11th of April 1933. I'm nearly 84 years old, so if I have some memory slip-ups, forgive me.
Would you mind telling us about your childhood a little bit and your parents?
I was born in, I believe, Salt River Road, but we lived mainly in Woodstock, in Cavendish Square behind the police station. And then we moved up in the world to Observatory, 9 Station Road, and then 32 Mostert Road, all gone under Hout Bay Hospital now. My parents were born in England, emigrated to the Cape in, I think, 1928 or 29, maybe a bit later. I've not been able to establish the date, and they came with my older brother, who's 6 years older than me.
What did your father do?
What didn't he do? He grew up in the East End of London, and he did all sorts of odd jobs. He became a sailor right through World War I. At the end of World War I, he and my mother went to Australia. He became a window cleaner there. My mother didn't like Australia, so they went back home, and then he went back again. But when she was pregnant with my brother, she insisted on going home to have him. And so, but he couldn't settle. He wanted to come away, came to Cape Town. And here he had a petrol service station right during the Depression years. And people used to pay with odd bits of furniture if they didn't have money for their petrol, you know. I remember a vacuum cleaner that we had lasted for about 30 years. And then he had a little cartage business. During World War II, did a lot of cartage for the military building camps, you know, and the seaward defense batteries. And he used to get fed up with people who were stealing the contractors. They would drive in with a load of sand and get paid for it, drive out, get paid for taking it out, drive back again, another load of sand. He was very angry with that sort of cheating. People got very rich that way. So I want to tell you, corruption is not new in South Africa. The end of the war, his trucks were worn out, and he was, from the heavy driving. Trucks in those days were very difficult and heavy steering. And he opened a bookshop, a left-wing progressive bookshop. By then, people weren't buying books about the war and about left-wing politics, communist politics. And so he became an estate agent, made a bit of a living, enough to send me to university. That was my father, and eventually, well, as you know, I ended up in prison, and he ended up getting a pension from somewhere, living on next to nothing. Came to live in Johannesburg because I was imprisoned in Pretoria, so he could visit me.
Why did you choose to study civil engineering specifically?
Why civil engineering? Because when I was 13, I was a voracious reader from the age of about 6. But when I was 13, I was reading the wonder books of Y and Howe, the engineering marvels of the world, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge, the Panama Canal, and I wanted to build. But also I grew up in a political home. I wanted to build for people. And that meant all people, not just apartheid South Africa or segregation people, whites only. And so I was able to get to university. It was touch and go financially, because in my matric year, I actually wrote the railway's apprenticeship exam in case Dad couldn't pay for it. And Kenny Vanello and me from Observatory Boys High both wrote the exam, and I'm told he came first nationally and I came second. That's quite an achievement, you know. And he later came to university after tech, because he was even more broke in his family than my family. And so I got to university and studied civil engineering. And while I was studying, discovered really that I could build for whites, couldn't build for people. You built the Cape Town, when they planned the Cape Town railway station, they made the railway lines duck and dive under each other, costing billions more than should have because of apartheid. You couldn't have the black railway stations near the centre of the town and the white platforms near the docks. So you had to make the trains go. And that sort of thing, and what was happening in World War II, because of political home, I knew I had to get politically involved. So I worked as an engineer. I worked for the Cape Town City Council. I built roads. I was an engineer. I designed stuff in the city design office. I worked for a contractor. I worked on the Salt River Power Station. But in 1960 there was the state of emergency and I got arrested. And when I came out, the security police were worried that I'd blow up the power station, so they wouldn't let me work there anymore. And so I got various jobs as an engineer until 1963, when, as a member of Umkhonto we Sizwe, it was too dangerous to hang about, too well known. 90-day detention act came into effect. I left, went to Johannesburg. I was going on my way out the country to get properly trained as a military person. And my comrade said, "Dennis, you're ready now. You can build it, you know how to blow it up, stay." So I stayed and got caught and, well, as you know, Rivonia trial, number 3 accused, ending up with 4 life sentences. I always make the joke, I was going to die 4 times. Life is till you die. But I survived it, and here I am. Went to England after I was released to be with my family, had gone to exile. Worked in the ANC office full-time. Spoke all over Britain, Europe, all over Europe, America, Canada, United Nations, for the ANC, solidarity work, until we switched off the lights and the ANC became the government. Then I set up a charity called Community Heart, Health, Education and Reconstruction Training, and it's raised millions of rands for rape crisis, for a project called Ububele Psychotherapy Project in Johannesburg, Good Hope Psychological Services in the Boerland. We've shipped in about 3 million books in English for kids. And if you think of 3 million books, 50 rands a book, it's 150 million rands worth of money that the government didn't have to spend, because the decision of our people was that kids must learn in English. Well, how do you learn if you haven't got books? So that was my contribution. And the project still runs. And I've set up my own Denis Goldberg Legacy Foundation now to continue the work I do. If you look in my home, you'll see there's a huge art collection. Look at these models, extra skinny, hung theatre, funny, looking like fashion models, and but all over the house. And so I leave that to my foundation. And the idea is to build an art and cultural centre in Hout Bay. We're still negotiating with the province. And if you want to negotiate with bureaucracy, it takes a long time to get the land so we don't have to buy land, but also to be next to the museum. And the point about it is then it makes the museum more viable and it makes us more viable. It gives a synergy between the two. And the purpose of this is an art and culture skills training centre. With the artwork, with my record collection, CDs, DVDs, documentary films, art books, plus room. I'm a patron of the Kroonendaal Music Academy of Hout Bay, and raise a lot of money for them, have over the last 7 to 10 years as well. 150 young people involved in music from all Hout Bay, because we think Hout Bay must become Hout Bay, not Hangbach, Imizamo, Yetu and the village and valley. It's got to be Hout Bay. And so that's what this project does. And that for me is almost more important than the fact that, I mean, just imagine kids from the Hangbach and IY who they have nothing and no hope, but they come to this very beautiful house under heritage protection. I want them to see what's possible in a life. I want them to know they're worthwhile people. You have ambition, you want to play, try. Here's an instrument, here's a teacher, try. And we've had some very great successes with a couple of young people going to university to study music. Some just make a bit of a living out of playing gigs. But more important is, I am somebody. That's the most important thing for me. And if you think about it, that's what our Constitution says, restoring the dignity of our people. And our politicians talk about it and we do it in practice. I believe you have to actually do it so that people know what the possibilities are. And I'm still doing it. This exhibition I'm putting on at the Castle Military Museum, part of their renovated facilities, together with Calvin Gilfillan, who's the CEO there, is about the Third World and the Second World War. And the point about that is that the history we're taught at school is about how Britain and France fought Germany and Italy. They don't tell you very much about France taking 1 million soldiers from Africa to fight their war. They don't tell you about the raw materials they took and hardly paid for. They don't tell you about the Cape Corps, 23,000 men. They don't tell you about the 80,000 Africans in the South African Native Military Corps. And they don't tell you that the white soldiers got a pension and were kept on the strength till they got jobs, got money so that they could get a bond to build a house. Black soldiers and coloured soldiers were immediately dismissed, no pay. And so there is a film we're hoping to get for this exhibition called A Bicycle and a Pair of Boots. Soldiers who were not white got their uniform and their blanket and their water bottle. If they were sergeants, they got an extra blanket and their rucksack. And they got a small cash pension. The children of whites got regular money for their upbringing until they were 18, for coloured kids till 16, black kids till they were 14. All of this went on. And I want people to know this. I want people to know that not only Africa, but people in South Africa are not just takers of history, we make history. And you must not be forgotten. It's about pride, it's about dignity, it's about respect, and demanding respect. And I saw this exhibition in Germany, and it was 5 years ago. Spent 5 years raising the money to get it translated into English, produced there, shipped here, and we're adding a big section on South Africa. From the internet, we found stuff, we found photographs from the archives. It's going to be a fascinating exhibition, really it is. But it's about, for me, undoing the injustice of the past. You can't bring back people's lives, but you can say to their children and grandchildren, we respect you, or respect your parents and grandparents. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, going back to when you were at university, I heard there was this organization called the Modern World Society.
Yeah.
What was that about?
Well, you see, there used to be a student socialist society, but then in 1950 there was the Suppression of Communism Act, and they said all socialists are communists. Students who believed that young students and working people should meet together formed their Modern World Society to talk politics and the growing threat of apartheid and what it would do to education in our country. And when they tried to bring young people from off campus, that's a no-no for the university. So they then set up from that a modern youth society, which met off campus. And I joined them when they were a few years old already in Cape Town, and became very active in it. I do have to tell you that I got to know about them because I moved into a flat with my mother in Sea Point. And there was a very attractive young woman who was already politically engaged. Met her, went to meetings with her. Well, we eventually married. She made an honest man of me by marrying me. And we had children. I have grandchildren out of that line. And so I became very quickly involved. And what I learnt was, because I was meeting comrades, black and coloured mainly, youth in Cape Town, in their homes, meeting their families, learning in practice, not the statistics of apartheid, what it meant to live as people were forced to live. And I'll give you an example. In Retreat, there was a shack settlement called Blowfly. It was an old sand pit, so when it rained, the water was on the surface. People put their beds on concrete blocks. Sometimes babies fell out and drowned. But there was a smallpox epidemic, or fear, because a ship came in with sailors with smallpox. And the City of Cape Town Health Services inoculated all whites and coloured people, but not Africans, as if the smallpox bacillus can know what colour skin they're biting through. And so at Blowfly, where we were organised, I got a doctor and I got medical students, got the equipment from the city, and we inoculated the whole community, a couple of thousand people. And what fascinated me was I asked a local doctor for some of his old hypodermic needles as a scratcher. They're throwaway stuff. And he asked me what for, and I told him. He said, but you're taking my clients away. How much do you charge each client? £1. How many, £2 then. How many have you inoculated? None. So I said, do you want me to go and tell the community you won't give me throwaway needles? What do you think it's going to do to me? He gave me the needles. There was another doctor who said, no, she won't go there unless there's police protection. I said, but I assure you it's organised. Eventually we get there, the whole community is lined up, chairs for the elderly, sunshades for the elderly, young people with bottles of water for the elderly. This is the 1950s, bottled water wasn't a thing you went to the shop for. Whole thing just 5 at a time, just inoculated with a doctor, a friendly doctor. But just imagine a city that inoculates its population, but not the people who also do the real work. We could only do one little group, you know. But that was the kind of practical way of dealing with the politics of apartheid and building support for a movement of people to understand the deep nature of what we were fighting. It's humanitarian, but it's political as well. And I haven't changed my attitude. If I'm doing this exhibition, yes, it's transferring knowledge through art and culture. It's much better than long speeches. Pictures, videos, audio stuff and so on. But it's political. I want people to know where we come from. I want to know who made us and not ignore a lot of people who made us. Just to give you one little story, in 1942, November, during World War II in Libya, at a place called Sidi Rijek, 5,280 South African soldiers of the 5th Infantry Brigade fought the Germans. They were defeated. Only 2,000 of the 5,280 survived. So over 3,200 were buried on the battlefield. There were stretcher bearers, coloured African and white soldiers, all buried together. Hot desert sun. When Pretoria headquarters heard, they ordered the bodies dug up and buried separately. You were fighting a war and you waste your soldiers' time digging up bodies in case they lied together when they've died together. This is the kind of absurdity we come out of. I want people to know about it now. I want people to know. I want to know those who say, well, it wasn't so bad, you know, it wasn't so bad. The inhumanity of it, the disrespect. And sadly, we see the disrespect today, the elderly, mentally disturbed patients who weren't cared for. Why do we lack compassion? But it's not new. It's not new. It's not suddenly something in South Africa. This has been built into us over 300-400 years. We have to deal with it. I'm sorry, I'm giving you a political lecture.
No. Tell me about the night school. What was the night school?
Well, I wasn't around then, but I've heard about it. Our attitude was people need to understand their own situation. In the 1950s, less than half of all black children went to school. Most black workers were illiterate in English and Xhosa. They couldn't read and write. Great believers in democracy, somebody who could read would read the newspaper to people. They'd sit around, and discuss. And so, believing in people's right to knowledge and to information, long before it became a catchword, my comrades in the Modern Youth Society organized a night school for the workers in the docks. You know where the marina is now? That used to be the barracks for black dock workers. They had to find the finest part of Cape Town. But then there was no transport cost to go to work. I laugh at the absurdity of Cape Town, you see. And so they would learn to read by reading political newspapers, not the cat sat on the mat. The wages are low and there's a strike and you learn the language of politics and labour and conflict and so on. That's what it was about. And there was one story I heard, a man called George Peake came out of District 6, and during World War II he'd been a sailor on a minesweeper in the Mediterranean Sea, and he came to the night school. He wanted to learn French. And our people said, why don't you stay and teach English instead? And so George Peake became a great political activist. He became an organizer. He was a building worker in the Building Workers Trade Union. He organized people. He became, I think, chairman of the Modern Youth Society. Got very strongly involved in Coloured People's Congress. So if you want to know what the night school was about, that was the purpose.
Okay. What was your involvement in the Congress of Democrats?
Oh, well, when it was formed as an ally of the African National Congress, Coloured People's Congress, Indian Congress, and for whites, Congress of Democrats, to ally with the African National Congress. And I was variously treasurer, chairperson, deputy, anything, do everything, make it happen, make things happen, make sure meetings happen. made sure there was a platform on the Grand Parade with loudspeakers, so there was public meetings of the joint congresses. I was always the technical guy. I wasn't a public speaker in those days. In those days, if you asked me to make a speech, I went blush red, and somebody would shout at me, and I'd really and truly. But you need different people. Some people would write pamphlets, and I would produce the pamphlets somehow. Or we need posters, I would make the posters, and so on. That was my role. I make it sound little, but you can have all the good ideas, unless you get people to be with you, the ideas mean nothing. So that was my role.
You were involved in the liberation struggle for quite some time, but why specifically join Umkhonto?
Why join Umkhonto West Eastway? Because we'd reached a point where every protest was met with violence, not just in Cape Town. The people of Sekhukhune land demanding grazing rights. Their cattle would be impounded, they would be attacked, they would be put in prison. But the real turning point came with Sharpeville, where the 89 was shot dead. I think 186 were wounded. And we don't talk about the same day in March 1960, with the protest at Langa, where 3 people were shot dead, and I think 30-something wounded. And the point about Langa, Sharpeville was important. That caught the headlines. And protests, with marches and protests everywhere. But in Cape Town, took place where Parliament was in session. And the next day, not led by the ANC, but by a group of PAC people that had broken away from the ANC, and a young man called Philip Khasana, in his blue shorts and his tackies and a t-shirt, led 30,000 people out of the townships. And they marched up to Deval Drive and down to Parliament to demand something be done to end this violence against people. Well, they led Philip Khasana into an office where he could meet high-ranking people. They put him in prison. And then said, well, he's asked you all to go home, to the crowd, so they went home. And then the state declared a state of emergency for 4 months. I was arrested, my mother was, 20,000 people were arrested. And we really thought things would change. But what changed was tougher laws. At the end of 4 months, most of us were released. And we said, no, we've got to continue. We can't go on with the increasing violence. But at the same time, people all over the country were saying, we've got to go out and we've got to kill, 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 until the whites understand they can't go on this way. Well, the leadership of the Congress movement, ANC, Indian Congress, Coloured People Congress, Congress of Democrats, Congress of South African Trade Unions, no, SACTU it was called at the time, South African Congress of Trade Unions, said if there's going to be violence, it has to be controlled. Individual acts of terrorism breed such violence from the state forces that it will be an endless bloodshed of our people. It took a year of discussion, and eventually, led by Nelson Mandela and a group of others, among them Joe Slovo, Walter Sisulu and others, the decision was taken to launch Umkhonto West Eastway, to take on the armed forces of the state, not individual acts of terrorism against individual passers-by, because that simply creates such a heightened sense of I'm going to get you, and a counter-violence that we would never withstand. And so, Denis, you're a civil engineer. If you can build it, you can blow it up. Will you join? Yes. Now the question is, why join? Because if you fight a war, people are going to die. Well, first, people were dying. The violence wasn't coming from our side at all. It was from the state trying to keep itself in power. But I'm a child who grew up during World War II. And my heroes were the people who fought behind the lines. In Italy, the partisans were called partigiani, it's the same word. In France, they were called the maquis. In Eastern Europe, they were called guerrilla fighters. Inside Nazi Germany, there were people who risked their lives against the Hitler regime, literally gave their lives in the most brutal ways. Well, I knew that at some point, if this happened in South Africa, I would have to do that. Because if you, as a white and privileged, and a first generation privileged white South African, if I just stood idly by, I'm then part of what I know is wrong. Which is why I joined the Congress of Democrats, politically. When the situation became so intense that whatever we did, we were followed by the security police. Our telephones were tapped. We would go to meetings, they would be there. We'd get a new member, they would go to that person's employer and say, you know what this person's doing? Get them fired. If they were black, it meant they were endorsed out of Cape Town, back into the countryside, and their families would starve, and so on. All of this going on. And so, why did I get involved? Because I believed I had to. But it was given point for me, because the first big political campaign I was involved in was the call to the Congress of the People. And 1953, Professor Z.K. Matthews proposed to the ANC that we convene a Congress of the People to be a new national convention, following the history of 1909, the national convention that led to the Union of South Africa. But we would have all the people of South Africa involved. Invited the government to arrange it, of course. Of course, they didn't even answer the letter. And so some 10,000 meetings were held. People wrote down what they wanted to see in the new South Africa. But I must tell you first that that call to the Congress of the People was such a poetic document. We used to read it in two voices, male and female. Let us come together to speak of freedom. Let the peasants speak about the need for land. Let us speak about water. Let us speak about work in the factories. But done so beautifully. And I spoke all over the Western Cape, got arrested on occasion and so on. Led to the Congress of the People. I didn't attend, but I arranged that people got there. But one Saturday afternoon, organising in, there's a quarry in Simonstown, and the community was called, I've forgotten. But there was this quarry, and you know, a quarry has benches where they cut out the stone. They start wide at the top and benches. The shanties were built on these steps. There was no running water, no toilets. And when it rained, the water came just pouring through everything. That's where I was deployed to organize. And people held meetings. They wrote the most beautiful notes. We want an end to the past laws. We want the right to a proper house. We want proper work, all sorts of things. And one Saturday afternoon I spoke there. Monday I was working on the railways. government employee got fired. Democracy is a dangerous thing, you see. I was lucky, I was given a month's notice. They could have fired me in 24 hours at the time. And so, for the first time in my life, couldn't pay the rent, sold things to pay the rent, had a wife and 2 kids, borrowed money, which took me over a year to repay, until I got a job and then paid it back gradually, and came to understand in my personal life what the mass of our people were living through. So all of this comes together. We protest peacefully. We say South Africa belongs to all who live in it. You put the leaders on trial, 156 arrested in the treason trial. They were found not guilty, but it took 4 years to take people out of action because they want to be equal. And so when the time came, yes, I was there. But this Freedom Charter starts. We declare for South Africa and the world to know South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white together. And no government can claim legitimacy unless it represents the voice of all its people. And then sets out the conditions: equal rights, right to work, education, religion, land, free assembly, but it ends with very powerful words. These freedoms we shall fight for side by side, all our lives until we have won our liberty. Well, in effect, I didn't write it, but I helped get people there to agree that that's like a commitment, an oath. I'm going to be there. So if my comrades say we're going to move on to this, how can I say, no, I've got my comfortable life, you go ahead, I'll watch. A lot of them did that. Black and white. Not everybody was involved, because if everybody had been involved, it would have been over long ago. But I couldn't, as a matter of conscience, because I could not be part and responsible for apartheid. I had to show I was against it. Well, governments don't like it when you blow up their offices, you know. They get a little irritated with you. They just made tougher laws, 90-day detention, which was for torture. And eventually my comrades in Cape Town said, I should go overseas, get myself trained. Left my family, my 8-year-old and my 6-year-old daughter and son. Went to Joburg, and they said, stay. And there they were preparing a major uprising, would I make the weapons? And they needed me as an engineer. I was known in Joburg, so I stayed. Except that I was known, and 6 weeks later, we were all arrested at Lilliesleaf, ending in the Rivonia trial. And in a way, the trial was a turning point in South African history. Not just for Nelson Mandela's speech, and I was sitting next to him, almost. He was 1, Walter Sisulu number 2, accused I was number 3, Governor Mbeki, father of the 2nd President, Thabo, number 4. We're all on trial there. And Nelson Mandela ends with that famous speech, this is an ideal I hope to live to see achieved, but if needs be, it's an ideal for which I'm prepared to die. And I don't remember any of us showing fear. He was speaking for us all. Nevertheless, when it came to the end of the trial, and the judge said the appropriate sentence is the death sentence, but I'm not going to impose, he imposes the life sentences, we laughed. I am a bit known for my mother calling out and saying, what is it? And I said, it's life, and life's wonderful. And here I am with Janine, overlooking Hout Bay. It's a gorgeous view. You're filming me telling you this story. The sun's shining. I'm involved in the community. I made it possible for there to be a football club here. I really have made it possible for them to do that. Because what are the kids going to do? But do lots else besides. The Music Academy, other projects around South Africa. And in a country where we defeated formal apartheid. And we're building a new country. And it's exciting because people use the democracy enshrined in our Constitution. I think sometimes people make a mockery of it. They don't take seriously the substantive issues, trying to score political points. Just to give an example, whether you keep it in or not, your business. Had the DA said we should have a minute's silence for the people of the people with mental disabilities who died, there would have been no problem, I'm sure of it. But when you get up and say, we want a minute's silence because the ANC government of Gauteng massacred 94 people, there's no way it can be agreed because of the word massacred. It means you're agreeing to it. Were they massacred? There was a whole chain of events. And for a parallel, there are people who say Thabo Mbeki is responsible for the deaths of so many hundreds of thousands or millions of people from AIDS. What about the young men who can't keep their flies done up? Or the young women who have sex knowing do they bear no responsibility? A hormonal drive so powerful you don't care who you infect? I don't agree with his policy, but the accusation that he killed so many people is unacceptable to me because it's a distortion of reality, and I don't like that. It shifts personal responsibility to somebody who actually can't control what you do. And then it leads to a breakdown of the procedures in Parliament. But it was deliberate. It was a deliberate provocation. So I'm holding no brief for the President himself. But there are important issues to discuss, not these petty points of order, in my opinion, petty points of order. So we've come a long way, and it's right that people use their democratic rights. But I think they're also being abused.
I'd like to ask you, what was it like being freed after 22 years? What were some of the first things that you did after being released?
Well, the first thing I did was that the commanding officer of the prison said to me, he's brought his own car to drive me to the airport. I've brought my own car for you. So I kicked the tires. I said, I'll give you 10 rands for it. I was just mocking him, you know. He was very offended because he thought he was doing me a favor riding in a Mercedes. But, you know, I was free. There was nothing he could do. On the other hand, it was him and me and I don't know, 3 or 4 sergeants to make sure I didn't make a run. And there was a load of security police in a car in front and a load behind. Maybe they were protecting me, I don't know. Because there would have been a lot of people who would have liked to have finished me off. There were a lot of people who were disappointed I wasn't hanged. They thought life sentence was too light. And the reasoning was this, I've heard it since, and I believed it at the time for myself. Had they hanged Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu, there could well have been an uprising. They were great leaders, popular, huge support. Had they hanged me, white South Africa would have rejoiced. He is the traitor, the Volksverraaier. And my black comrades would have mourned me, but there wouldn't have been an uprising. That's the cold reality that one understands in our country. So that I wasn't hanged was really a surprise. And life's wonderful. So when I came out, I had a choice. I could fly in South African Airways direct to London. My daughter was on a kibbutz in Israel. I could fly on an El Al plane to Israel. And I took a cold, calculated analysis. If I fly on a South African plane, this is South African territory. Anything can happen. The captain represents South Africa. Somebody could bump me off. And they would say, well, it's an ANC person. You know the way politics gets played. If it was an El Al plane, the Israelis had too much to lose. Because their game was, we will help the Jewish South African come to Israel. That will give us a free hand to deal with the Palestinians. Therefore, they weren't going to allow anything to happen to me. So I flew with El Al and met my daughter and my wife at the foot of the steps. What was it like on the plane? Man, I don't think they needed engines. I could have just lifted it off myself. But it was so funny because I got a headache. And I don't know if it was all the noise in the plane, 300 people all talking at once. But I did have a slicky cognac. I can still taste it, you know. Jaunty, forgive me. But I got such a headache. And I asked the stewardess for some headache tablets. And they're so busy. So she gives me the tablets. Aspro used to come in little pink papers, but it was crushed and powdery. So when she came past, she said, can I have some water? And she takes me to the galley. She says, come. And then she says, in this harsh Israeli accent, why have you got a headache? So I said, well, I've just got a headache. And she presses and presses and presses. And I said, I'm not used to crowds and the noise. Why aren't you used to crowds? Where have you been? And she's ready to give me the water in the galley. And I say, well, I've been in prison. And she says, well, how long for? And I say, 22 years. And she froze. She turned her back on me. She picked up a little black-handled kitchen knife. You know, they slice up the lemon for the drinks? And she's cutting the lemon, cutting the lemon. And I'm thinking, she must be thinking, 22 years, rape, murder and rape. And then, you know, if I was that kind of a person, I wouldn't say I'd been in prison. So slowly, slowly, she controlled herself, and she turned around and said, what were you in for? I wasn't imagining it. And I said, well, we were trying to overthrow the apartheid government. And so she threw down the lemon, she threw down the knife and said, welcome aboard our aircraft. It was really a very moving moment, because for the first time in 22 years, I was talking to somebody, and an attractive woman, I have to say, without any glass, no guards, nobody watching us. And they served me my meal. Man, there was no stainless steel Dixie, nice china, a little bowl of this, a little bowl of that. But I must tell you, I felt sick because there'd been 10 years of drought in Africa, East Africa. And you could see down the whole hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of just dry earth. And here you're sitting in this cocoon, drinking drinks, eating a little bit of this and a little tasty bit of that. It was disturbing for me, I have to say. And we sat and talked for 6 hours about her family, about my family. It was so sweet, you know. My wife was very jealous when I told her about it. Hey man, life's not easy, life's not easy. And my wife was waiting for me at the steps. And years later she told a journalist, I saw this man at the top of the steps, bald, gold-rimmed glasses, skinny, looking like his father, and thought, is that what I waited for? She could hit the nail on the head, my wife. And then she smiled at me. And that was enough. Eventually we got together, made it possible. She made it possible. And I have to say, out of prison, the nightmares of the 90 days of torture and fear of death, I was having terrible nightmares. She would have to hold on to me, stop me thrashing around. And there she was for me. She was quite something very special, I have to say. Her name was Esme, born Boerdenstein. Oh, that was her stepfather's name, from Johannesburg. But she was not only my wife and my lover and my friend, she was also a comrade, political activist herself.
How often did you get to see your wife or any family while you were in prison?
Eventually, in the 22 years, my wife was allowed to return from London twice. And they gave us 5 half-hour visits through a pane of glass. The only touch was when you put your hands on each side. There is a prison rule that children between the age of 2 and 16, 16th birthday, are not permitted to visit. They say it's too frightening for the children. But eventually, when my daughter was 15 and my son 12, hadn't turned 13 yet, they were allowed to come. They got letters from psychiatrists and so on to say it was necessary for them to know that I was alive. And they came to visit me and were allowed to sit in a circle with me. But the commanding officer of the prison made it so intimidating that my son, who was 12, said he wouldn't come again until he was 16. My daughter was a bit older, but she always could chatter away and entertain me. And then they would come every alternate year once he was 16. Until he was 18 and he came with his girlfriend. And that was very nice because getting words out of him was like finding hen's teeth, you know. But I would say something and they would, on the other side of the glass, talk about it. And so it became a kind of three-way thing. I owe her for making it possible for me to know my son. They're divorced now and they've each remarried and so on. But it was, I mean, imagine coming from England and coming to South Africa the first time and you stay with relatives and they bring you to the prison and you come in and the steel door goes clang and her chin went but she controlled it, you know, very, very strongly. It's very emotional, all this, you know. Prison's not a nice place. Stay out of it if you can.
What did you feel when you heard de Klerk make the announcement that the ANC would be unbanned, etc.?
I knew it was coming. I couldn't have told you when. And in fact, I must admit I was surprised it took so long. Because you could see the nationalist government gradually losing its self-confidence and control. There were some key moments, but we knew there were talks going on. The details were obviously secret. But I was travelling the world as an ANC spokesman, and people would say, when? And I'd say, well, I don't have a crystal ball, but it's going to be soon. Yes, but when will it change? I said, well, talk to me in 25 years' time. That's a generation from now. And if you want to know when we really change, talk to me 50 years from now, when I'll be 102 years old. Then I'll tell you how far we've come. Well, we've had the first 25 years from then, and we've come a long way, but we've got so many problems. I want to see what happens in the next 25 years. I want to be 102. 25 years from now I'll be 109, but it doesn't matter.
And now I'm curious, why did you, or how did you end up in Hout Bay?
Why in Hout Bay? Well, I was living in London. I'd been an ANC spokesman. We closed the office. I set up a charity. And I worked myself into being a burnt-out case. I was going to my office of community heart, health education and reconstruction training with a long list of things to do. And I'd go home an hour later having done nothing, just staring, couldn't do anything anymore. That's the burnt-out thing. By this time, my first wife had died. I'd married the German widow of a South African comrade. She had married Zenzo and Corby, who was the son of the Treasurer General T.T. and Corby. And he had died, and so she felt she had to marry another ANC person, so she married me. And she came to live with me in London. She was a journalist. She wrote books about South Africa and regular reports as well, very good ones, eventually in German. And she insisted on bringing me home because I couldn't function anymore. My Hout Bay, well, if we went to South Africa for a reunion at Lily's Leaf, and President Zuma of the ANC did the official launch of the Lily's Leaf Trust. And I must tell you, at that thing I spoke, and I ended my speech by saying, President Zuma of the ANC, I lay a task upon you. The slogan of our civil service is Bato Pele, people first. But it's not happening. The task is to transform the civil service to serve our people. Because if you don't, we'll end up with Bato Pelile, people finished. I know it's mixing up languages to make the word play. And he went up on the platform and he said, my Western Cape commander has spoken, I will accept the task. Well, I want to say to him now, you haven't. You haven't done it. You've allowed the corruption to become so deep, right to the bottom of the civil service. Through lack of leadership, through tolerating corruption everywhere. I want to remind him of that sometime. And so I came, worked in Pretoria, Ministry of Water Affairs, travelled all over South Africa as a troubleshooter for the then ministers, first Ronnie Kasrils, then Bielwa Sonjika, and got to know the problems of South Africa quite intimately, including problems in the civil service, and discovered that civil servants without doing anything wrong, can sabotage very good policies. You have to draw up a questionnaire for an environmental impact assessment. That's the short form. They take 2 years to draw up the questions. 2 years to ask the questions and collate the answers. That's too long. But they've done nothing wrong. We've just canvassed all the opinions. Nonsense. Anyway, and so I looked for a place where I would eventually live. I'm a Cape Townian born here. I wanted to come home. I have a cousin who lives just in the next street. Her husband is a world-famous architect. He wanted to build my house. I think he's done a very good job. But they showed me this plot of ground. And so I was in a position to buy it. I did. But I had looked in the city bowl. But I couldn't walk at the time, just as I'm struggling now with arthritis. And there you get to a block of flats. First there's 30 steps, then the lift. So I couldn't live there. And so I had to look for a place where I could drive my car in and eventually get into a wheelchair and roll in with no steps. That's why I live in Hout Bay. But more than that, I'm a born Cape Townian. I've lived in Salt River, Woodstock, Observatory, Sea Point, Lakeside. And I know that in Cape Town, if you can afford it, you've got to have a view of the mountain or a view of the sea, and here I've got both. That's the truth. And what a view, right? But Jonty's got the view as well. You know, I want to tell you the absurdity of apartheid. They take people from the village under Group Areas Act and make the village white. And they give the people they've driven out the most sheltered part from the southeastern. Aren't you lucky? I'm just mocking the absurdities of a system that thinks so crazily. You know. But you can see I've got a glassed-in balcony because the architect made a beautiful balcony that we couldn't use because of the wind, because there was no roof on here and the seagulls sat on this lattice work. And you know what seagulls do when they get wind up their tails? It's a messy business. And so slowly, slowly we had to make it usable where we're sitting.
Now, I just want to ask you one more thing. What would you like to see happen in the next 25 years?
We have to tackle seriously the corruption. It's not that corruption's new, but it's become so deeply ingrained at every level of society now, not just among the big contractors. I must say I get very upset when the big construction companies point fingers at the government. They stole $9 billion in building the stadiums for the FIFA World Cup by overpricing. They were penalised with $1.2 billion in payback. They got away with $8 billion. And they say government's corrupt. So this is what I mean. But right down to the smallest village, right down to some civil servants who say, I'm not paid enough, I don't have to work hard. But we praise Madiba for his sacrifice. And I say, whose sacrifice? What are you saying? So you ask me what I want to see. I want to see a society where this dream of this vision, a realizable vision of a South Africa that belongs to all who live here, come about. It's not going to happen in 25 years. It's going to happen down the line. Because there are always people who say, when we were young, it was this. We want it that way for selfish reasons. But I think we've made real progress. I go onto campuses, I get asked to lecture occasionally, and I see a difference because when I went to university in 1950, just white faces. Yes, white students do better because their basic education is better, but there are more black graduates than white graduates. These are the people who've got to change our country. I like the fact that the students are vocal. I wish they knew our history. I wish they would understand that the university student population is about 6% of the population. They can't have everything for themselves. What about basic education? What about primary health care? What about more clinics? What about better pay for nurses and doctors, key people? What about you making it happen instead of saying, you make it happen? It's a shift of attitude, but I understand the roots of it. The oppression was based on what we call the national oppression of black South Africans because they were black, of coloured people because they were coloured, of Indians because they were Indians. And coloured people were defined in our laws then as not African, not white of European descent, not Asian. They were everything not. Well, what an insulting way to define a people. And we have a problem, we have censuses, and we ask people to state their ethnicity. We don't like the word race. And everybody has no problem except the coloured people, who say, why, if we're non-racial, do we have to say it? Well, how do you iron out the inequalities of the past? Better education for whites, better housing, better facilities, unless you know where you need to spend the money. So you have to ask. But in asking, you perpetuate the use of these terms. And it's a very difficult problem. But there's a practicality about it. You can get around it, like using ethnicity instead of race. We don't like the word native in South Africa, so we speak about mother tongue education. All the world speaks about native tongue. But we can't because of apartheid past. And every country has its own particular political language. When do we get to the point where we're just South Africans? I don't know. But we know it's possible because we've written it into our constitution. And when somebody behaves outrageously racist in their talk or behavior, there's such an outcry, whereas before it wasn't even talked about. So we're making progress. I would like those in power not to follow the example, a worldwide example, of using power for personal gain. I'm an idealist, and I'm privileged. But I've given up enough in my life to say it's possible to actually not demand everything, except for the 4 years that I worked as an advisor in the Ministry of Water Affairs. I'm not taken from government. And even then, when I went to work in the ministry in Pretoria, they said it'll take 3 weeks to connect my computer to the printer down the passage. We can't do it early, we're too busy. Having taken 2 weeks to come and set up my computer, my laptop. And I said, well, I've got work to do. And I said, well, what's your hurry? So I went and bought a printer. They said, are you mad? I spent 125 rands. You know, I mean, you waste that on liquor. Are you mad? They might well let you take it home. That's it, but I'm doing the work. That's my attitude. Now then, you must buy the biggest car you can, and you must write off the interest for against your taxes. And I said, well, I bought a little Corolla and I paid cash. Are you mad? Why aren't you taking? Drives me crazy. Drives me crazy. Will we overcome that? There are always good people. There are lots of good people. I just want them to becoming the dominant group. I want the good people on top, not the bad ones. This feeding frenzy on state. You see, if you call it state money, then it's impersonal. That's our taxpayers' money. The president goes to court and we taxpayers pay. And it's his personal problem. The SABC has got a problem, the taxpayer pays. Why? This is an abuse of power. I want us to fulfill the dream we had. These freedoms we shall fight for side by side all our lives until we've won our liberty. Not my liberty, our liberty. And we're still doing it.